Masechet Hagigah Daf Yod Aleph. I realized that I skipped a line yesterday, so I'm just going to go quickly back to Daf Yod at the end of it, at the beginning of it, where you say Vela Yosef Vela Ba and Shalom. The rest of the pasuk that we were discussing said, someone who comes or goes has no peace. What is this referring to? Peshat, it sounds like it's referring to someone going to war or traveling a lot. Amar Rav, kevan sheyotze adam midevar halacha lidvar mikra shuv en lo shalom. But the rabbis say it's referring to someone who is studying halacha and then he goes to study mikra. He has no peace. Well, one thing is that whenever you change subjects and you're doing one type of learning to a different type, it's a different mode of thinking. And here, some of the Mefarshim explain that when you learn the Devar Halacha, you learn all the Midrashim of how you got it from. When you go to learn Mikra, then you start learning Peshat and say, wait, in context, that's not what that pasuk means. And then you have no shalom because you have to reconcile what the Halacha taught with what the Mikra says. Shmuel says, no, it's all within Torah Sheba'al Peh, going from Talmud to Mishnah. Now, Talmud, when Shmuel talks about Talmud, he's not talking about Masechet Hagigah. He didn't have a finished Talmud Bavli, but he means rather two types of learning. Mishnah being apodictic, memorizing the laws of the Mishnah. Talmud means deriving one thing from the other. And so if you're involved in deriving one thing from the other and using logic, and this is one type of learning that gets you very involved, and then you go and just learn the plain Mishnah. Well, it doesn't work because when you learn the plain Mishnah, you go, no, wait, why is that? That's not what we learned. We learned that ukimta about that. It contradicts something else. And your mind automatically wants to go into delving deeper into the matter. And then when you just learn plain Mishnah, you can't do that. And the person's mind is not at rest. Rabbi Yochanan says, even from Talmud to Talmud, the commentaries say it's going from Talmud Yerushalmi to Talmud Bavli or the other way around. But this is anachronistic because Rabbi Yochanan, Rambam says he authored the Talmud Yerushalmi, but it means, that is not literal because he's only second generation. There's more generations after him. He set the foundation of study in Eretz Yisrael, and the Bavli wasn't completed yet. So rather, Rabbi Yochanan, it means is when you go from studying in depth one subject matter that has its rules and how it works, and then you go to another subject matter in depth altogether. If you keep changing, then your mind is not quite at ease. I feel that every time we start a new masechet, you have to get into the mode and the rules of that new subject. And at the beginning, right, everything seems shaky until you start getting into and getting used to the pattern. And then you appreciate it better. Okay, so that was just the last line before with the Mishnah that we began. And now we're in the middle of talking about this Mishnah that said different categories. We saw that the laws of Shabbat and Chagigot, that's why we brought this all in the first place. Our Mikra Mu'at and Halachot Merubat, there's only a few Pesukim that tell you about Hagigah, but there's a lot of halachot. And then we saw we're going to see the last category now about dinin, avodot, taharot, tumot, arayot, which have yesh lahem al mashi smochu. They have a lot of pesukim, so a lot of basis to rely on. And these are the essential parts of Torah. So that's what we're about to discuss right now. Note arayot here because we're going to complete the first perek right now and begin the second perek. And the second perek starts with teaching arayot and the rules of to whom and how many people you can teach the laws of arayot to. And so with that, we go straight to our daf, which is Yud Aleph. And we are here. Okay. Mikra mu'at v'halachot merubot. Tana. Negaim ve'ohalot. Mikra mu'at v'halachot merubot. So other things that are also, they're within the category of Tumah and Tahara. The laws of Negaim, is this certain spot, is it Sarat or not? Or Ohalot, if you have a corpse within inside a covering, then everything else inside that tent, in that room, becomes tameh. All of these laws have very few pesukim, and yet very in-depth, a lot of halachot. We ask about that. Negaim mikra mu'at, negaim mikra merubehi. Are you telling me that the laws of Sarat, only a few pesukim? There's 2 whole chapters in the Torah about it. There's plenty of pesukim. So Amar Papa, Hagigah, Papa says, you're right. I'm rewriting this baraita. Negaim mikra merubeh v'halachot mu'atot. The laws of Sarat have a lot of Pesukim, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh that's added to it is relatively little. It's Ohalot that is Mikra Mu'at Valachot Mirubot, the laws of tent impurity, that has just a little bit of Pesukim and a tremendous amount of oral law that is developed on top of it. What's the difference? Why does it matter? And the difference is, if you have a question and you're not sure about something regarding the laws of Sarat, then go straight to the Pisukim, because the Pisukim lay out all the different cases that right there. But if you're not sure about something regarding Ohalot, then don't bother with the Pisukim, because there's so few. Go straight to the Mishnah, and that's where you'll see all of the laws laid out. Wonderful. Now, dinim, civil laws. Michtav ketivan. Why are you telling me in the Mishnah that the civil laws, monetary laws, have very few pisukim? There's tons of pisukim about civil laws. Look at all the different cases that are mentioned in Parashat Mishpatim alone, and the Sefer Devarim too, everywhere. La nisracha ela kedrebi. Says, okay, you're right. There are a lot of pisukim, but there's still a lot of details that are not known about how to explain those very pisukim. And here's one example. Detanya, Rabbi Omer, nefesh tachat nafesh mamon. The case here is about two men fighting, and they have intent to kill each other. But one of the men, he goes to punch the other guy he's fighting with, and he misses, and he hits a pregnant woman and causes, one case is he causes a miscarriage, then he pays. Another case of imason yihiyeh, if he causes that mother to die, then it says nefesh tachat nafesh. If we take that literally, that would mean he is a murderer. Now, this is interesting because although he had intention to kill the man, he did not have intention to kill the woman. So what do we say about that? Some say, nevertheless, he is a murderer. We call this transfer of intent in American law, that if I have a gun and I'm pointing it to person A and I miss and kill person B, doesn't matter, even though I didn't mean to kill person B, I did mean to kill someone, and therefore that person can still be convicted of murder. And so that is one opinion. The B disagrees. The B says, I only pay. Even though I killed the person, I didn't have in mind to kill her, I wanted to kill this other guy. And so therefore, it's still not allowed, but I only pay, and that does not deserve capital punishment. Now we ask about Rabbi. How do you know it's money? Maybe it means he's really a murderer and deserves capital punishment. It says the same word, menatan, in the previous pasuk, menatan biflilim. If he causes a miscarriage, and according to the Torah and in halakha, a fetus is not a full life. And so therefore, someone that kills a fetus is not a murderer. Doesn't mean it's allowed, but doesn't rise to a level of murder. And so there it says you give money, right? Well, according to the assessment of the judges. So if the word give there means money, so to here to give also means to give money. It does not mean capital punishment. And all this, how would you know this without the oral law? So you see, even here where we have a pasuk, but the pasuk by itself is ambiguous, and so we need this is mikra mu'at and halachot mirubot. This is one example of the halacha that we need in order to interpret the pasuk. Next category is avodot regarding korbanot. Korbanot, you're saying is few pisukim and a lot of halachot. Michtav ketivan. Look at all the laws of korbanot all over Vayikra. There's tons of it. Why are you telling me that? Oh, well, here too there are many details that fall between the cracks that you wouldn't know unless you had the oral law, the Mishnah explaining it. And here's one example of the transfer of blood. When you do make a sacrifice, you have to do shechita. Then someone has to collect the blood. All right, that's one avodah. And a kohen has to also carry the blood, transfer it from the place of slaughtering to the altar, and then one has to bring it on the altar. So all these are necessary avodot, those 4 avodot. And the one about holachat dam is as essential as all the others. And you wouldn't necessarily know this from Pesukim. So let's see. Tanya v'hikribu zo kabbalat dam. When the Torah says v'hikribu, we translate that as to offer or to sacrifice, but literally lehakriv means to bring close. So literally, it sounds like this is referring to taking the blood and bringing it towards where the altar is. But this midrash says this is referring to receiving the dam. Now, if it's referring to receiving the dam, then why does the pasuk say v'hikrivu? It should say v'kiblu, v'yikabel hadam. Why would it say it in terms of bringing it close? Here's why. Dichtiv v'ikriba kohen et hakol v'iktir hamizbecha v'marmor zo holochat ebarim la kevesh limemra doholacha la tapeka mikelal kabbalah. Because the pasuk says you should bring close the everything towards the mizbeach, and this has to be talking about holachat evarim. The next pasuk right after this says you take the limbs and you burn them on the altar. So v'hikriv cannot mean to offer. Hikriv here has to mean actually bringing them close. And so you see that holacha, that carrying, is not excluded lo tapeka from the category of collecting from accepting it. So the basic point is that just like when you're actually putting the blood on the mizbeach or receiving it, we know those are necessary, and because they're necessary steps, the Kohen has to do it with his bigdei kehuna, he has to do it with his right hand, all kinds of laws. So too holacha, which you might think just transferring it, anybody could transfer it. Even someone who's not wearing the clothes and with his left hand, it's not essential. No, that's why it mentions over here, hikribu, this is kabbalat hadam, even though it's talking about collecting, it uses the word of transferring to teach you that transferring is as essential as receiving, and all the laws of what the Kohen has to do apply to transferring also. Okay, all this is very complicated, and you wouldn't know it just from the Pisukim. And here's an example of the oral law adding to the written law. And teharot, what's an example of things that are purity laws that I wouldn't know from the Pisukim? Ichtav ketivan. There's lots of Pisukim about how to become pure. To know the size of a mikveh, because the Torah says just here's a braita quotes that pasuk that he shall bathe in water. Okay, so not just in any water, you can't just go and take a shower. It means you have to go to a mikveh. If since you have to wash all of your flesh, it means all at once. So you can't. Again, the shower be a problem because you're washing just one part of your body at a time. So it has to be enough water that you can completely immerse yourself. All right, good. So that's what the pasuk says. But how much exactly is that? If you take a box and you make it 1 amma, meaning a foot and a half, about by 3 amot, so that box a person could crouch down and fit into. It's pretty tight, but you could fit in there. And if you do the calculation of volume to a liquid measure, it comes out to 40 se'ah. This is about between 80 and 120 gallons of water, and about the size of a large bathtub, which makes sense because you have to fit in it. That much water. And so you see that while the pasuk does say yes, you have to wash your body with water all over, it doesn't say exactly how much. And so therefore, this is another example of, although there are explicit pisukim, we need the oral law to come and explain them further. Temeot, michtav ketiva, laws of tum'ah. There's lots of laws of tum'ah. So what do you mean that this is mikra mu'at? La nisracha ela lechadasha min hasheres de la ketiba. Detanya bahem yachol bechulan tamod lahamar mehem yachol miksatan tamod lahamar bahem. Okay, regarding shedasim, the Torah mentions 8 different reptiles, creepy crawlies that have a high level of tumah if they're dead. And it says these are temem lachem bechol es kol nogeya bahem. So first the pasuk says if you touch them, right, then you become tameh. The next pasuk, as it goes on, says v'chol asher yipol alav mehem, from them. So we want to know why is it, and then it goes again and says bahem later in that pasuk. How come sometimes it says bahem and sometimes mehem? So this is to teach us the minimum size, that if you just take, if there's a dead rodent and a little piece comes off of it, the tiny, tiny piece, that does not cause tum'ah because it's too little. So what's the minimum amount? It will be a size of a lentil, which is less than for most other things. So this is a stringency regarding shirasim. Now, how do we know that it should be a chadasha? So because it says bahem, anyone who touches them. If you only had the word bahem, I would think bechulan, in the whole thing, you have to touch a full, complete dead rodent. But then the pasuk says mehem, meaning from them, meaning a piece of them. If I just had the word mehem, I would say even the tiniest bit. Yeah, but the pasuk says bahem, meaning it itself. So how do we reconcile the whole thing versus bahem, a piece of it? Has to be a piece that is in some way significant enough to be like a whole. And the rabbis looked into it and they said, oh, this is a lentil size, because a chomet, one type of creepy crawly, that she says it's a snail, some say it's some type of lizard or chameleon, whatever it is, when it's first born, it's so tiny as a lentil. And so it's a full being, right? It's alive, it's a total thing, and yet that's the smallest possible. So that's something that is both bahem, because it's a whole being, and it's also mehem, so that even if it was an adult and they only have just one little bone of it, if it's the size of a lentil, that causes tum'ah. Or another way that the rabbis derive it is from a lizard's tail, that if you cut it off, it's still moving around. So still moving around, it's like it's still alive. And that is the size of a lentil when it's very small. And so that also is both its own being and also the smallest piece and the smallest thing that it would be a live being. And so therefore, even if it's big, if it's the size of a lentil, it causes tum'ah. Less than that does not cause tum'ah. Good. All that is something that we wouldn't know just from the Pesukim. And so that's called mikra mu'at. Arayot, michtav ketivan, the laws of arayot, of all the forbidden relations. That's the whole couple of chapters about it. We read on Yom Kippur and Acharemot there. So what do you mean that this is mikra mu'at? Lots of pesukim. The case is a man rapes a woman and it results in a child. And so that child, that child, would that man, he's not only a rapist, but he's also a really bad guy, if he has relations with that daughter, it's his daughter, would that be permitted or not? Would that be, because after all, it's not his wife's daughter, because he never married her, but a result of rape. So obviously it's not going to be allowed. The question is, what's the source? All right, this is just in shorthand. Here's the full pasuk. One pasuk says, "Irvat isha ubita lo tegale." A woman and her daughter, one may not be with, which would even apply to, let's say, a man married a woman who already has a daughter from a previous marriage, and so even if they get divorced, the man would never be allowed to marry that daughter from that previous marriage. Good. So we know that. But that is a case where the person's actually married to her, cannot marry the daughter. But in this case here, because the man only raped her and did not marry her, so that daughter is not technically is not his wife's daughter, even though it's his daughter, right? But it's not his wife's daughter. So that pasuk by itself would not be sufficient. But we have another pasuk that does say "Edvat bat bincha or bat bitecha lo tegale edvatan ki edvatecha henna," and this also has the word henna in it. And here it's one's granddaughter, son's daughter, or daughter's daughter. And so this is important because this is someone who is kind of it's related to his daughter, even though the granddaughter is not his wife's daughter or wife's granddaughter, and yet this is also not permitted. And so it says the word henna in both cases. And so by putting them together, we can learn that every daughter would not be prohibited, whether it's his wife's daughter or not his wife's daughter, but if it does come from him, and therefore these two together with henna teach that this case of bitom anusato is not allowed. So that we learned from henna and henna. And now this pasuk also says the word zima. So now we want to know, what is the punishment if someone does it? All the different arayot have different levels of punishment. So this says the word zima. And in later on in chapter 20, where it gives all of the punishments, it says if a man regarding a woman and her daughter, this is called zima. And over there, the punishment is burning with fire. And so to here, the punishment would be the same. So that's zima zima. So you see that this is very complicated stuff, right? You have to make charts of how everybody's related. And this is not something that would be explicit from any pasuk, but obviously this has to be prohibited. The question is why? Well, this is mikra mu'at, and so you need the oral law to come and fill in and explain these details. Okay, finally, hen gufet Torah. The Mishnah ended saying these are the essential parts of the Torah. The Bashat of the Mishnah sounds like these, meaning the last category, the things that have a lot of mikra. Those are the essential parts of the Torah, because that's what the Torah talks about, a lot of it. So we ask, Hanein Hanachla, these are essential parts of the Torah, the rest aren't. The Hagigah and Heten Nedarim, those are not the body of Torah, they're not essential. No, Ela Emahen Vehen Gufei Torah. No, it means to say, even though all the first categories do not have a lot of mikra, nevertheless, they also are essential parts of the Torah. Don't think that because one has more pesukim and one has less pesukim that are any less important. They are all essential to the Torah. Hadran alach hakol chayavin. So we complete this perek, but the next perek actually is going to be a continuation. And this is just one sampling. The complication here regarding arayot of the reason behind the halacha in the next Mishnah of chapter 2. Okay, famous Mishnah. And dorshin ba'arayot bishlosha. One may not teach regarding the laws of forbidden relations with 3 people. See, the Gemara is going to explain that this would mean 1 teacher and 3 students. So that's not allowed. It would only be allowed if there's 1 teacher and 2 students, because you got to really concentrate. You don't want to make a mistake, and there's very subtle differences between one law and the other. And if you make a mistake, the result could be a terrible avera. Meuvat lo yuchal litkon. It could result in a mamzer, and therefore only in a very small group can you teach the laws of arayot. And the regarding Maaseh Bereshit, this is about creation. How was the world created? What was going on at that time? And there were a lot of people during this time, Greek philosophers, Gnostics, that were delving into this whole realm. Plato has a dialogue on this called the Timaeus, all about the beginning of creation. And so the rabbis also thought about what was Maaseh Bereshit, delving into Bereshit Perek Aleph and understanding its secrets and details. Well, these are also very subtle matters that, if you can trip up on, if you misunderstand it, and therefore you cannot teach it to 2 students, but rather only one-on-one, so you could make sure that the student got each point and is not going off into incorrect ideas. And Maaseh Merkava, this is the explanation of the Pesukim in Yechezkel that talk about the divine chariot. Rambam says this is talking about theology. Rambam says Maaseh Bereshit is basically physics, and this would be metaphysics, things about the divine. We actually have works called Hechalot literature from the time of the Talmud. So we actually have a pretty good idea of what exactly they were talking about. So these are all kinds of mystical ruminations about the heavenly realm. And here also, a person can, because things are very, very subtle, a person can think he understands, but really misunderstand. We have an example of this of Elisha Acher, when he went into Pardes and he sees and what he thought he saw was 2 beings, two divine beings, right? Like a good power and an evil power. Obviously, he was wrong, but you see that when one goes and delves into these matters, it can be quite dangerous because they're so subtle. So therefore, regarding Maaseh Merkava, you can't even teach 1 student. Unless the student is so wise that he can figure it out on his own. So only someone who has a broad mind and can link one thing to another, then the teacher can just give him Rashe Pirakim, right? Just here's a little hint, just a direction, right? Look there. And but the student has to figure it out on his own, right? If the student can figure it out on his own, then he's worthy of understanding. But you may not teach this at all. All right, super, super interesting. And then the Mishnah continues, says, anyone who looks into the following four matters and tries to understand them, it's better that he never came into the world, was never born. As a kind of midah keneged midah. Male mala, male mata, male fanim, male achor. What is above the firmament, up in the heavens, in the divine realm? That would be connected to maaseh merkava. Male mata. What's under the world? What happened before lifnim? What happened before creation? So you're allowed to understand creation, but not before creation, because that's kind of a paradox, right? What happened before the beginning of time, and what's la'achod, and what's going to be after everything, after the end of the world. These are matters who can understand. So I think that makes sense. Midah kemidah. If you want to know what happened before the creation of the world, then better that you yourself were never created. Anyone who is not concerned for the honor of his maker, also better that he did not come to the world, to the creator who made him, because these matters, if you say what's above, right? What happened before God created the world? Who created Hashem to begin with? What's above God, right? All these things are going to automatically lead to saying things or thinking things that are disrespectful to his creator. All right, so this is quite a deep Mishnah, and let's see how the Gemara is going to explain it. Amart beresha velo b'maaseh velo b'merkava b'yachid. Hadar amart ela im ken haya chacham umevin mida'ato. We seem to have an inner contradiction here. At first you say you can't teach maaseh merkava to one person. That sounds like to nobody. You can just not teach it. Maybe you can learn it yourself, but you can't teach it to anybody. But then you said, unless he is chacham min ba'ato. So that means you can teach it to one person. Okay, what the question is getting at is that the question is related to the word be, the particle be here. When you say endoshin barayot be shlosha, it sounds like it could be read as with three altogether, including the teacher, right? And if you take it to mean that would mean you can't teach arayot with a group of three. A teacher being one and two students is not allowed. So therefore, arayot has to be one teacher and one student, only two people altogether. And if you follow that, then Maaseh Bereshit you cannot teach with two, but rather only with one, meaning only by yourself. And then in that case, B'Maaseh Merkava B'Yachid would mean you can't teach it at all. You can't even learn it. But yet it does say here that you can guide someone if they have understanding themselves. So this be can't mean altogether, including the teacher. Hagigah, and here's an explanation that will explain that and explain this seeming contradiction. Endoshin barayot lishlosha. The first one means, as I explained it when we started, that you cannot teach 3 students, but you can teach 2 students. Lo maaseh bereshit lishtay. Maaseh bereshit you cannot teach to 2 students, but you can teach it explicitly to 1 student, so 1-on-1. The lo maaseh merkava le yachid. Maaseh merkava you cannot even teach explicitly to 1 person, but that 1 person can learn and can be guided if he can figure it out on more or less on his own. Then he can sit before you and you just give the headings, the title headings, and let the person figure it out. Okay, good. All right, so now we go to the first one. En dorshin barayot bishlosha. No teaching the laws of incest and forbidden relations to 3, only to 2 people. My ta'ama. We want a source for this. We're going to try out a few different sources from Pisukim. In the end, we're going to say it's common sense, logic. So what are the Pisukim? Ish, ish, el kol she'er besaro. The rest of it is lo tikribu legalot erva. So ish, that's 2 people. And she'er besaro, the flesh that's related to him, that's another person. So 3 people are mentioned all together in the beginning of this pasuk, and then it continues. It says, "Lo tikrivu," don't approach, don't come close regarding legalot erva, regarding the laws of arayot. So therefore, you see, 3 people should not study the laws of arayot. So maybe that's the derivation of it. Now, of course, not the peshat. Lo tikrivu lagoteva is a euphemism for actual sexual relations. But here they're taking it as, don't come close to the subject matter because you may make a mistake, and then one will make a mistake regarding that. Ela me'ata dichtiv. Ish ki yakalel Elohav. Ish asher yiten mizrah lamolech hachinameh. And we say now we reject this because there's lots of places in the Torah where it says ish. Are you going to apply the same thing there when it says each person, any person who curses his God, or any person who gives to his children to Molech worship? Are you going to say here also that you cannot teach these laws to even 2 people because it says ish? There's no law about that. There's nothing wrong with teaching those laws. It's important to teach those laws. Rather, you know why it says ish there? To include non-Jews, because non-Jews are also required to know those laws. One of the Sheva Mitzvot Ben Noach is that they are not allowed to curse God, and so ish means teach the Jews and teach the non-Jews regarding this law. Non-Jews also, one of the Sheva Mitzvot Ben Noach is that they may not worship idols, and so they cannot worship Molech. So it says ish. Make sure every single human being, Jewish and non-Jewish, knows that this is prohibited. So we're going to apply the same methodology here to arayot. One of the Sheva Mitzvot Ben Noach is also forbidden relations. A non-Jew also is not allowed to be with their close relatives, and so ish there or here also means that we have to teach Jews and non-Jews regarding the laws of arayot. So therefore, you see that actually means the opposite. You should teach these explicit laws, and so we cannot learn it from here. La midichtiv ushmartem et mishmarti ushmartem tere mishmarti chad. This is the concluding pasuk in Vayikra 18, which is a list of all the forbidden relations. And it says there, observe my charge. And it says that in plural, you plural. And then mishmarti is singular, so that's 3 people. And so to not do any of these chokukot to'evot. And so we can learn from this pasuk that they cannot be taught to 3. You have to be careful, watch out, make a fence regarding these, and don't teach it to 3 people. Ela me'ata, no, that can't be. Dichtiv, ushmartem et hashabat, ushmartem et hamasot, ushmartem et mishmeret hakodesh. Hachinameh says the word ushmartem in lots of places. Are you going to tell me over there also that we can't teach this subject? You can't teach laws of Shabbat, right? Or making masot? Or keeping sacred things, so that doesn't make sense. Okay, first, an important clarification. When it says you can't give a public lecture and teach about arayot with 3 people, it means it's talking about the hidden parts of it. Of course, everybody has to know the laws. This is the reason why on Yom Kippur, when everybody is in shul, right, in the afternoon, we specifically read this chapter because they're so essential, and we have to make sure that everyone knows the laws, who you're allowed to marry, who you're not allowed to marry. If you don't teach these, people won't know them. So obviously, you're not allowed to teach these. You must teach these laws, the explicit cases. But we're talking about the secrets of them. Maybe there's some kind of loophole in certain case where it'll be allowed. If you start teaching those things, that's where people will misunderstand, take advantage of something that they think is a loophole or something. And that's what is a much more subtle and secretive matter. My tama. Now, what's the source? Sevarahu is logic. When you have 2 students in front of a teacher, and then they get into some subject matter, one of them will be having a back and forth discussion or argument with his teacher, and the other one will be listening to what they are saying. So that way, everybody is on the same page and they all understand it well. If when you have three students there, then sometimes, when you get deep into a subject, one of the students will get into some subject matter with the teacher and they'll be discussing it back and forth. The other two students, they'll be distracted because they'll be arguing among themselves. Now, even when you have a group, sometimes the class, kind of breaks up. And the other two, because there's someone else there, they won't be following necessarily what the rabbi is teaching with one student. They'll be discussing something else. And then they won't hear what the rabbi taught about that. They'll only hear the last thing that was said and not the clarification. And then they may come to permit something that is actually prohibited in the area of arayot, and that leads to disastrous situations, mamzerut, and so on. And that's why you can't have that. So it's simple logic, just the way classrooms work. If you have only two students, then they will both be paying attention. Okay. Hold on. If that's true, then we should do that for the whole Torah, right? If we're learning Hilchot Shabbat, also there, we don't want people to make a mistake. And if we're discussing laws of Torah, right, with one teacher and student, the other two students are distracted, then that it's also bad. So maybe we should say never teach any part of halacha with more than two people. No. Arayot shaneh, damar mod gezer arayot nafsho mehamedatan umitave lahem. Laws of forbidden relations are different because the rabbis say that theft and forbidden relations are things that a person desires very much. And therefore, that's going to cloud a person's judgment because a person desires these things so much. So if he is some gray area that he didn't hear explicitly and misunderstands, he's going to, not even on purpose, he's going to kind of assume that it's allowed. Whereas in the laws of Shabbat, person doesn't have an inner desire that they have to break Shabbat. So then they'll go back and check and make sure they have it right. But here, a person's desire will cloud their judgment, and that's why these have to be especially taught with only two people. Now, you just said that gezel is one of these things that will cloud your judgment because everybody wants to go and steal. So then that also those laws should be taught with less than three. And we say no. Arayot ben befanav ben shelo befanav nafish yisrei. Gezel befanav nafish yisrei. Shelo befanav la nafish yisrei. The laws of prohibited relations, a person will be desirous for whether such a situation is before him or not, right? Whether this person who's not allowed is in the room or not in the room, a person is thinking about it. And therefore, no matter what, it's not allowed. But whereas theft, a person, if you present to someone, I once went to the ATM machine and it was processing for a long time. And then it spit out a whole bunch of bills like this, huge thing. And I thought the ATM was broken and it sent, gave me, I don't know, like $50,000. And then I had it in my hands. And just when you're holding it, like, wow, maybe I should just walk out because, right, once it's in your hands, you're like, okay, I got to, you overcome with desire to just take it. Turns out it was all singles. It ran out of any other bills. So it wasn't that much money, right? But that's the idea. One is not thinking about stealing. I'm like, oh, right now I have to go and rob a bank. No one's thinking about that. Only once it's in your hands, then you have a desire for it. And therefore, stealing, you don't have to worry if you're learning the laws of stealing and someone gets distracted and then they're going to go back and say, hold it, do I have to tell the bank about that? If they're not in the moment, then they will go and check the law carefully. And so really it's only arayot that has to be taught with three. Okay, with less than three. And now the next laws are regarding creation. Have to be taught not even with two people, but one-on-one, because it's even more subtle. You have to be even more careful. What's the source? Yachid shoel ve'en shenayim shoalim. Pasuk in Devarim says, if you should ask about the early days, right? Has ever happened that one nation was taken out from another nation and saved and all that? So now it's regarding the early days. And Peshat is talking about, a long time back in history, but technically it means even the very first days. So are you allowed to learn about the first days of creation? It says yes here. It says here that yes, you are allowed. One person is allowed, but not two. Ki she'alna, singular. One person is allowed to ask. One student. How about just a little bit before that, right? A few days before that. Is that permitted? No. Talmud Omar lemin hayom asher bara Elohim adam al haaretz. If someone asks about the early days, starting from the day that Hashem created man on earth. So in other words, one is allowed to analyze, learn about from day 6 where Adam was created and on, right? And that you can learn about about man and how was he created. But before that, not allowed. Hold on. Well, how about the first 5 days of creation? Is that not allowed? They're mentioned in the Torah, so if it's mentioned, sounds like we're supposed to learn about it. So yes, indeed, that is permitted, right? Because it says from the days that were before you. So yes, you're allowed to analyze how Hashem created the world, all about science and the development of how things came to be from the time of creation and on, but not before. How about now space-wise? What is above and below? And also before and after. These are the 4 categories in the second part of the Mishnah. And so the rest of that pasuk in Devarim says, should you ask about the early days, what happened and check from one end of the heavens to the other end of the heavens. So that is allowed. Mi lemikse shamayim ad kese shamayim ata shoel. Ve'en shoel ma lemala or ma lemata, ma lifnim or ma le'achor. You may ask questions about what happened from this end of heaven to that end of heaven, but that's it. That's the limit. That's the border. So you can only ask up until heaven, but not allowed to. No point in asking what's above heaven. You just, as human intellect has limitations, and we're not going to be possibly understand it. And therefore, if we try, we're only going to misunderstand it. And so that's from one end of the heavens to the other, and that explains why not what's above and not what's below. And similarly, what's not what's before and not what's after, because after all, when before there was any world, there was also no time, because time is related to space. You see, the rabbis knew that these are related, and therefore, if there's no space, there's no time, so there's no point in asking what was before or what was after either, right? So yes, we're supposed to use our minds and study everything within the world, within time, but not anything that is beyond. Rambam explains it. For example, if someone tries to read print that's way too small and he can't see, he's going to end up being all blurry and making up words and just getting the wrong idea. And then his eyes will go bad, and then he won't be able to understand even things that he would have been able to read beforehand. And therefore, we should stay away from matters we cannot understand and focus our attention and learning on things we can understand. And when those things are very subtle, to make sure to study them with small groups so that we don't make any mistakes and get it all right. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.